Hey peeps, today I'm talking all things piping. Depending on where you want to add your piping, you may find that you need to make it go around corners. This is fairly easy to do, and these are the tips and tricks that I have for you for this application. I have the yoke pieces of my dress put together. I'm putting the zip into my dress on the right hand side as I'm wearing it. I'm not sure if there's a correct side that a zip should go for a dress, but for me, I like it on the right hand side, and that's how I've sewn it. So I've sewn my outer yoke, which is the one that I put the piping onto earlier, and all the interfaced pieces together. This, as I say, is a tutorial for how to add piping to particularly this dress, but how to add piping to anything. If you want to see the full tutorial for making the 9076, there is a full video of the sew along up here. I have got my yoke pieces sewn together. What I have done is on the front very lightly mark the pivot point of this angle, and then the pivot point on this angle, which is where the midriff section attaches to the upper yoke. You actually only sew that to a large circle. You leave this piece free. So I am going to need to put piping on this area here. So this kind of like rectangle shape here, and then I'm also going to need to put it onto this rectangle shape, but I have attached the back midriff piece as well because I'm going to continue the piping around the back as well. So on your project you need to have a think about where you want to put your piping, as you saw at the beginning of this video, and then once you have chosen the places that the piping is going to go, you need to assemble the pieces up until the point where piping has to go in before you can do the next step. I'm going to work with the spool of piping in my lap. We want to put the wrong side of the piping to the right side of the fabric, and I will pin this in place just to start it off. I do the same with bias binding. I don't tend to pin this into place, especially if I'm working from a long roll. I don't want to pre-measure and cut the correct amount of piping because it has to go around corners, and I'd rather have too much than too little. What I'm going to do for this one is I am going to carefully make a mark at the pivot point on my piping, and I'm doing that by laying the piping down, and I've got the pivot point as you saw was where the seam was left open. So I'm going to make a little mark on my piping, and I'm just going to take a pin and put it through that mark and make sure that that lines up with the pivot point, and it does. So I'm going to use my zipper foot and I'm going to sew all the way along to this pivot point. Leave the needle down, clip into my piping, move the work around, and so that I can go up this side. And again I'll mark that, and then so that I can do the same thing, clip into the piping so that I can then go around that piece there. So I'll end up with something that looks a little bit like this. So I'm going to move the camera so that fingers crossed you can see what I'm doing, and we can get started. Okay, so I have my zipper foot on, I've got my walking foot or the dual feed attachment down. Having that extra option just means that both layers of fabric theoretically should move together. I've got my needle moved all the way over to the left. I have the raw edge of my piping against the raw edge of the fabric, and I've got the right side facing up, as you can see. So I'm going to just backstitch at the beginning. And keeping the raw edge of the piping even with the raw edge of the piece, we're going to sew up until the pivot point. I have actually folded the midriff seam up. That's just, like I say, to make it a little bit easier. The thing you want to make sure is that you're not catching the seam of the piece on top. So I'm going to be careful to not catch that in my stitching. So the mark that I made earlier is actually a little bit off, only a little bit. But again, this is why I don't like to pre-cut the piping. And if you're worried, you can just do a few stitches check everything until you're happy with where everything's sitting. So I'm being careful not to catch that extra piece of fabric. Folded that out of the way. Okay, got a couple more stitches to go. Okay, I'm happy with that. Right, so I'm going to leave the needle down, turn the work around, and I want to go up this now straight edge. So I'm going to cut into my piping flange really carefully. Don't want to cut through the stitching, but I want to make it so that it's easy to turn the work around. Once I'm happy with where everything is lying, I'm going to sew up to the next pivot point. I'm approaching the next pivot point, so what I did was take a pin and I've put it through where I guesstimated the next pivot point was, because I have marked it on the fabric underneath, but I can't see that because of the piping. So I've put a pin through and it's a pretty good guesstimate. So I have then gone in and marked it with my friction pen. So I'm now going to sew up to that mark. And this time I'm going to just make it a little bit easier and make it so you can see what's going on. I'm going to cut up to, but not through, the flange on the piping. So again, we don't want to cut through the actual stitching of the piping. And it's just the piping I'm cutting, not the fabric. To that pivot point and stop. And raise the work up, turn everything around. We will trim off some of this excess piping flange later, but for now we just want to get it into place. Back stitch at the end, needle up, foot up, take the work out from under, then I'm going to turn it over and I will cut off the excess piping and the excess threads. We've now ended up with some corners turned, and again when we turn everything back under it's going to look like this. So we will need to do some trimming to make sure that everything is going to lie nice and flatly. So you can see for this one the piping flange is kind of lying over itself, so there's extra bulk in there, so I'm going to trim that away. And then down here I've got some seam allowances to trim away as well. So we're basically going to do the same for the other side, but this time it's going to be in reverse. So we're going to start from the armhole, go up to the pivot point, go down to the waistband, and then we're just going to go all the way around the waistband or the midriff panels right to the back panel that we sewed on, or that I have sewed on for this particular pattern. Like I say, if you are using this particular pattern and want to see how it goes together, there is a full sew along for this, but this piping method will work for most dresses that have yoke sections like this that go into, or multi-paneled bodices. So again, same thing, I want to start my piping with the fabric right side up. I'm going to overlay the end bit just because this is cut on an angle, so I don't want to end up with the flange of the piping being too short and not getting caught in a seam allowance later on. I'd rather have too much than a little bit too less. Bring that under the presser foot, back stitch to start, and I'll go a little bit closer to the pivot point before I mark it, just so that I'm not stretching anything out, because this piping fabric was cut on the bias to help it go around corners, but that does mean it is a little bit stretchy. Okay, so pretty happy with that. It's going to be about there. I was a little bit too far, not far enough, so yes, about there. So I will make my mark, cut into the flange. I'm calling it flange, I don't know if that's the correct terminology, I think it is. So I'm going to sew up to that mark that I've made, which will correspond with the mark and pivot point on the dress. When I get there, keep my needle down, turn the work, realign. This one is the one where the flange of the piping will overlap a little bit. Convex and concave curves. Don't ask me which one is which, I couldn't tell you without looking it up. But we're going to sew down. And if you find pinning easier, please do pin. At the end of the day, whatever method works for you is the correct method. This is just what works best for me. So I prefer not to pin or cut precise lengths or almost precise lengths. I just find it slightly easier to work like that. Okay, so we're coming down to our pivot point. So again, I'm going to mark in my pivot point, which is just a little bit up from there. So you can cut into this with when you get to it with the needle down in the work, as you saw earlier, but it isn't the easiest thing to do. So this is my preferred method. Making sure my raw edge is even with the work, the piece of fabric that I'm sewing this to. So we've got to the pivot point, and we're going to go around the corner. This is why I like to make my own piping, because the seam allowance on the piping is the exact same seam allowance for the pattern that I'm using. And I tend to work with big 4 patterns just because I really like them and their block fits me quite well. If I ignore their recommended sizing and go for the sizing that I prefer, or the ease that I prefer. So when you do make your piping, bear in mind the pattern that you want to work with and the seam allowance that you're used to, especially if you draft your own patterns. So we're coming up to a join in the piping, but this is going to be on the side seam, and we've sewn this with bias joints as well, so it's not really bulky in that area, but it's not going to be like in your face join. Not that they are anyway, they're pretty subtle. But whereas with the earlier one I cut it off and didn't use it because it was right on the front of the dress, this one's going to be at the side seam of the dress, so it's absolutely fine. So again, it's completely up to you. You could have just used the join on the front of the dress. It's not super obvious. I have enough piping not to worry about that. I started with 19 meters. It'll be interesting to see how much is left at the end of this project. So I'm going to turn this over just so that I'm cutting off along the actual fabric. Cut that off. I'll go back and trim the start so that's nice and even, and that is the piping attached to the yoke. I've still got gathered pieces to put into this bodice, which I'm going to show you next. Once the gathered pieces are attached, I'm then going to go around and grade my seams and trim off all this excess of piping and seam allowance that's kind of hanging out in places that I don't want it to. But for now, this part of the piping process is complete. I will zoom out and show you what it looks like. That's what the front looks like, and that's what the back is looking like. So obviously I need to put in the rest of the panels for the dress, and I need to get those gathered up before I can do that. So gathering stitches next, and then I'll show you how I attach gathered panels to piped panels. You're never going to get an exact sharp right angle point with piping. It is going to give your corners a rounded look, but again, I really like how that looks, so that is something to bear in mind. I have one large video of all of the mini tutorials back to back, so hopefully I have covered what you're looking for in that. I will link to the playlist and all of the individual videos in the description down below. But if you have any questions, please let me know in the comments section down below, and I'll do my best to answer them for you. If you've enjoyed this video, you might want to check out this one here.